Why was the field so quiet when her blood hit the dirt? It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Not in training. Not here. The Georgia sun burned over Fort Benning as if it wanted to peel the skin off every soldier in uniform. Heat shimmered across the clay yard, the air so thick with dust it scraped the throat raw. Recruits grunted through bayonet drills, rifles slamming into sand-stuffed dummies. Each strike was supposed to sound like thunder. But after that boot connected with her temple, silence swallowed the field whole. Sergeant Elena Cruz didn't fall. She staggered, yes. Her balance fractured, vision splitting white and gray. Warmth seeped down her cheek in a red line sticky against the side of her jaw. Every instinct screamed for her to crumple, to let the ground take her weight. But she locked her knees, shoulders rigid, forcing her spine straight. If she fell, she knew what it meant. Not just weakness, not just failure. It meant validation for every whisper, every sidelong glance that had trailed her since she stepped onto this training yard. She pressed her palm against her head, smearing blood, and lifted her eyes. Staff Sergeant Rollins was still standing in front of her, his boot planted firm in the dirt, his smirk stretched thin. The look in his eyes wasn't regret. It was challenge, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, as if the kick wasn't an accident at all but a message carved through bone: you don't belong here. The recruits froze mid-strike. Bayonets hovered in the air. No one breathed. The sound of cicadas was louder than human voices. Even the instructors at the edge of the yard seemed caught between disbelief and complicity. Elena's voice came out low, steady, and meant for them, not him. "I'm fine." 3 words, simple and stripped down, but they hit like stone across water, rippling outward. She didn't blink, didn't wipe the blood again. Her eyes locked on Rollins, her chest rising and falling in deliberate calm. Her words weren't defiance. They were a refusal to break. But inside, her heart was a hammer. Combat zones had taught her how to ignore fear, how to work while mortar rounds shook the ground beneath her, how to steady hands pulling shrapnel from a chest while her own ears rang with gunfire. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where danger was expected. This was supposed to be training. Here, cruelty wore the mask of discipline, and the attack came not from an enemy but from the very man meant to lead. The thought lodged sharp inside her. What if this is who they are protecting? A sharp radio squawk cut through the tension. A lieutenant, pale-faced, had already seen enough. His voice cracked through the speaker like shrapnel. Incident at bayonet course. Immediate response required. The silence deepened. Minutes later, the hum of engines rolled in from the gates. Dark SUVs appeared, tires biting into clay, dust clouding up behind them. The recruits snapped upright instinctively, rifles tight against shoulders. Even Rollins stiffened. Authority had arrived. 3 generals stepped out, boots crunching on gravel like thunder. Stars gleamed on their collars, their expressions carved from stone. They didn't belong here. Generals never came down to the training field. Not for drills, not for disputes. Their presence was an omen. Something had traveled fast up the chain of command. Elena stood tall, blood drying on her cheek, her pulse hammering as the weight of the moment pressed in. She didn't know what was coming, but she understood one truth with absolute clarity. After this day, nothing would ever return to the way it was. The morning had begun like any other, with the Georgia sun punishing every breath. Elena moved through the drill as she always did, precise, efficient, measured. She wasn't the loudest, and she didn't need to be. Efficiency had kept her alive in Afghanistan, in Iraq, when chaos swallowed whole cities and the only rule was survival. But she wasn't supposed to be here, not in the eyes of some. Too decorated, too experienced, too female. That trifecta had made her a target before she even swung her first bayonet. The whispers had started early. Show off, doesn't belong, thinks she's tougher than the men. Combat had taught her the art of selective hearing, but whispers grow sharp edges over time. Rollins noticed her from the start. His corrections always harsher, his remarks laced with venom. Too soft, not aggressive enough. "Think you're special, Cruz," she, given him nothing in return, no flinch, no reaction. That only seemed to stoke his fire. This morning she'd broken formation for one reason: instinct. A recruit had faltered, knees buckling under the weight of exhaustion, sweat blinding him. Elena had stepped in, hand on his shoulder, guiding him upright. "Breathe through your nose, slow," she told him softly. It wasn't calculated. It was who she was: combat medic first, soldier second. That was when the boot came. It hadn't been a stumble, not a misplaced step. No, the arc of his leg was too deliberate, the crack of impact too exact. And now, blood streaked her face, while three generals closed the distance across the field. General Harris was the first to speak. His jaw was square, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He looked at Rollins, not Elena, when his voice cut through the air. "Explain." No anger, no raised tone, just judgment heavy enough to make the ground seem smaller. Rollins faltered, his voice tight. "Sir, I was testing her resolve, training discipline." Harris raised a hand, slicing the words in half. "Discipline does not come from cowardice or violence masquerading as instruction. Who authorized the strike?" The recruit stood frozen, every eye darting between Elena, Rollins, and the generals. For some, awe flickered. For others, fear. Authority, once untouchable, was cracking in front of them. Elena's head throbbed, her temple pulsing with every heartbeat, but she held steady. She understood something vital in that moment. Survival wasn't always about enduring bombs and bullets. Sometimes it was about standing upright in systems designed to fold you in half. Her silence was louder than any protest. The lieutenant recounted the sequence in shaky detail. How the recruit had stumbled, how she'd intervened, how Rollins's boot had connected with her skull. Each word hung heavy in the air, stripping away any illusion of justification. The second general, a woman with tightly pulled hair and eyes that missed nothing, turned toward Elena. "Sergeant Cruz, step forward." Elena obeyed, legs steady despite the ache in her skull. She stood in front of them, blood still visible, posture straight. She didn't bow. She didn't apologize. Her account was clear, stripped of embellishment. Just facts. Facts that cut sharper than any accusation. Rollins shrank with every word, his jaw tightening, his hands twitching. For a moment, he looked smaller than the youngest recruit. The third general gestured toward his aides. "Document everything. Eyewitness accounts. Every recruit, every instructor." Pens scratched. Cameras clicked. A yard once ruled by intimidation was now a courtroom, evidence gathered in real time. And in the middle of it all, Elena stood, wounded but unbroken. Hours later, after the SUVs had gone and the recruits dismissed, Elena sat alone in the medical tent. The antiseptic burned as a medic cleaned her wound, but she barely noticed. Her mind replayed the moment, the strike, the silence, the arrival of authority. She thought of the recruits' faces, their wide eyes, their whispers, the shift she had seen. Maybe standing up works. Maybe it's possible. The idea unsettled her as much as it comforted her, because standing up had a cost, and she knew that cost was far from paid. Outside, the sun dropped low, painting the yard in gold and shadow. For the first time that day, Elena let herself exhale. She allowed a private smile to ghost across her lips. Today had been more than survival. It had been a statement. And deep down, she knew the army would not forget it. Why did the generals come so fast? That question pulsed through every recruit's mind as the 3 stars swept across the training yard. Generals didn't descend without warning. Not here. Not for bayonet drills. Their sudden presence carried the weight of something larger, something unspoken, and every soldier watching knew it. Elena Cruz stood rigid, the sting of antiseptic still on her temple. Her uniform was stiff with dried sweat and blood, but her pulse wasn't quickened by pain. It was sharpened by awareness. Whatever this was, whatever it became, her part in it had already been written in red. Inside the administrative tent, the air was heavy with silence, the kind that suffocates more than noise. Clipboards clicked, pens scrawled furiously. The generals sat aligned like statues, every movement deliberate, every pause calculated. Their gaze pinned Rollins like a nail to wood. "Your conduct yesterday was unacceptable," Harris began, his voice low, steady, carrying weight without needing to rise. "It represents a systemic failure that will be corrected immediately." Rollins shifted, his frame no longer broad but caged. His hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, sweat beading along his hairline. For the first time since Elena had arrived at Fort Benning, he looked less like a predator and more like prey. Elena watched from across the room, her throat dry but her eyes unflinching. She thought the hardest part was surviving the kick itself. She was wrong. The real battle was unfolding here, in the tension between truth and denial, between accountability and arrogance. Harris gestured toward her. "Sergeant Cruz has provided a detailed account, corroborated by multiple witnesses. Her professionalism under pressure has exposed a failure within this unit." The word struck deeper than the kick had. Exposed, failure, professionalism. None of them were about her alone. They were about something much bigger, a rot that had festered behind rigid walls, hidden under the camouflage of tradition. "Sergeant," Harris continued, "you will assist in guiding corrective measures." The words caught her off guard. Her throat tightened slightly. She wasn't used to being singled out for praise. Her instinct was to step back into the shadows, but shadows were gone now. She'd been pulled into light whether she wanted it or not. She nodded once, voice steady. "Understood, sir." The investigation deepened hour by hour. Recruits were pulled aside, interviewed one by one. Their voices, some trembling, some defiant, painted the same picture. Intimidation masked as training, fear normalized as discipline, and instructors who stood by silent when cruelty replaced instruction. Elena sat through her own interviews repeatedly. Each time her words came measured, stripped of emotion but not of weight. The bayonet drills began at 800. The heat was extreme. Private Stanton faltered. I stabilized him. Sergeant Rollins then struck me in the head with his boot without warning. The other instructors did not intervene. Precision became her weapon. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't embellishing. She was testifying, knowing that truth, plain and unvarnished, carried more power than outrage ever could. Across the tent, Rollins tried to defend himself. His voice cracked, his words stumbled. It was meant to motivate, to test resilience, discipline. Harris's reply was surgical. "Discipline does not come from cowardice, it comes from respect, and you have shown none." The words echoed, not just in the tent but in the minds of every recruit listening outside. They weren't witnessing a scolding. They were watching a culture unravel, brick by brick. Elena sat rigid, blood faintly staining her temples, still, the ache a dull reminder. Yet inside, a calm was rising. Truth is more powerful than fear, she thought, always has been. Later that afternoon, she stepped outside into the glare of the sun. The yard looked unchanged. Dust still clung to boots, rifles still stacked against posts, but something in the air had shifted. Recruits whispered to one another, their glances sharper, more alive. Private Stanton approached her cautiously. His young face still carried the rawness of someone new to war's machinery. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke. "Sergeant, thank you." "For what?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. "If you hadn't stood up, if you had." He trailed off, words failing. Elena placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You did nothing wrong. Remember that. This isn't about you. It's about the system realizing it has to do better." He nodded, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. And she saw it then, the weight of fear he had carried every day. Fear not of enemies overseas, but of the men meant to lead him. That realization settled heavy in her chest. The generals pressed forward with questions sharper than blades. One leaned in across the table, his eyes unwavering. "Sergeant Cruz, how do you suggest we prevent this from happening again?" Elena hesitated only briefly. She knew her words mattered. Each syllable could ripple through the walls of Fort Benning, through the army itself. "Clear accountability," she said finally. Instructors observed regularly, not just during drills but in how they treat recruits. Any act of intimidation reported immediately. Hazing must end. Respect must replace fear. If the chain of command doesn't act quickly, nothing changes. The generals exchanged glances. They weren't used to hearing it this bluntly, not from someone at her rank, but they couldn't deny the truth in her tone. As the sun dipped lower, their orders came swift. Training programs suspended, instructors held in place under investigation, the unit itself under oversight until reforms were enforced. Gasps rippled through the recruits, for some relief, for others disbelief. Rollins sat pale and silent, his career bleeding out in real time. Elena, though, didn't gloat, she didn't smile. She knew the weight of change. It wasn't light, it wasn't easy. It pressed down heavier than the Georgia sun. That night in the medical tent, she finally allowed herself to breathe. The sting of antiseptic faded, the throbbing in her head dulled. Her reflection in the small metal mirror was stark, blood dried brown along her temple, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But something deeper lingered in her gaze. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a catalyst. And catalysts don't get to rest, not when the fire is only beginning. The next morning carried a different weight across Fort Benning. The air, once alive with shouted orders and heavy boots, was taut like a drawn bowstring. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps. Even birds seemed hesitant to cut across the sky. Elena's uniform was crisp, her posture precise, though the ache in her skull still pulsed with every heartbeat. She walked across the yard as if each step was deliberate, each movement scrutinized. And in a way, it was. Inside the administrative tents, the generals were already convened, senior officers pale and restless under their gaze. The atmosphere was clinical, yet charged, every word carrying the potential to alter careers, to reshape futures. Harris spoke again, his voice deliberate. This is not an isolated incident, it is systemic, and it ends now. Elena listened, silent. She wasn't here for praise. She wasn't here for vengeance. She was here because truth had shoved her into the center of a storm. And storms don't ask if you're ready. By midday, every recruit had been questioned, every instructor grilled. Reports stacked high, pens scratching endlessly. The tent became less a room and more a tribunal. And through it all, Elena sat calm, her voice unwavering, her testimony consistent. One recruit confessed to fearing retaliation every day. Another admitted to staying silent even when abuses happened in plain sight. Their words cut Elena deeper than the boot had. Fear had been currency here. Silence had been survival. She thought of her own silence in combat zones, not speaking of fear, not speaking of grief, because soldiers weren't supposed to. And now, she saw the cost of silence written across the faces of boys barely out of school. Her jaw tightened. This can't stay hidden anymore. As dusk fell, Harris called her into a private meeting. His hawk-like gaze was softer now, though still sharp. Sergeant, you've done more than endure cruelty. You've exposed systemic failure. Your composure under pressure is noted. What you did takes courage. Elena lowered her eyes briefly. She wasn't used to being told she'd done enough. Praise wasn't her goal. Change was. Thank you, sir, she said simply. But the credit belongs to the witnesses who spoke, to the recruits who endured. Harris studied her, the silence stretching before he finally nodded. Perhaps, but leadership means carrying the weight others can't. You've shown that. Elena didn't answer, because inside she knew he was right, and the weight was only growing. That night, as the camp quieted under a sky burning with stars, Elena sat alone. The echoes of the day hummed inside her, the testimonies, the recriminations, the judgments. She thought of Stanton's young face, of recruits whispering, of Rollins shrinking under authority. Change had been set in motion, but change has enemies. And somewhere deep in her chest, Elena knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Why did the generals come so quickly? That question clung to the recruits like sweat under their fatigues. Generals did not simply appear on training fields, not for drills, not for discipline. Their sudden arrival carried the weight of something larger, something dangerous, and every soldier standing in the heat knew it. Elena Cruz held herself steady, though her skull still throbbed where Rollins's boot had landed. The antiseptic sting had faded, but the memory of that strike pulsed with every beat of her heart. She wasn't afraid of pain. She was afraid of what it meant, that cruelty had become normal, that silence had been the currency of this place for too long. Inside the administrative tent, the air pressed heavy. Clipboards clicked. Pens scratched furiously. The generals sat in an unbroken line, eyes sharp, expressions carved from stone. Rollins was summoned to stand before them, but his presence no longer carried authority. He shifted under their stare, his chest smaller, his words slower, his hands betraying him with nervous tics. Harris spoke first, his voice low, deliberate. Your conduct yesterday was unacceptable. It represents a systemic failure that will be corrected immediately. The words cut deeper than any reprimand. They weren't about one moment. They were about a culture. Rollins tried to defend himself, his tone wobbling. Sir, I was testing her resolve, training discipline. Harris's hand lifted, silencing him. Discipline does not come from cowardice. It does not come from violence masquerading as instruction. You failed to lead, and you failed to protect. The silence afterward was suffocating. Elena sat across the room, her posture stiff, her eyes locked forward. She thought surviving the kick was the battle. She was wrong. The real battle was happening here, where truth and denial collided, where the future of this unit was being carved by words, not weapons. Harris gestured to her. Sergeant Cruz has provided a detailed account, corroborated by multiple witnesses. Her professionalism under pressure has exposed the failure of this unit. Exposed, failure, professionalism. The words didn't belong to her alone. They belonged to every recruit who had swallowed fear, to every soldier who had endured in silence. Then came the order that shifted her path completely. Sergeant Cruz will assist in guiding corrective measures. Her throat tightened. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted to be anyone's example, but the choice was gone. She was already the spark. She nodded once. Understood, sir. The investigation unraveled quickly. Recruits were questioned one by one. Some spoke with trembling voices, others with restrained fury. All told the same story. Intimidation masked as training, fear normalized as discipline, silence expected when abuse took the place of instruction. Elena repeated her testimony again and again. Each time her words were measured, stripped of emotion but solid with weight. The bayonet drills began at 800. Private Stanton faltered. I stabilized him. Sergeant Rollins struck me in the head with his boot without warning. The other instructors did not intervene. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't plead. Precision was her weapon, and every syllable built a case stronger than rage ever could. Outside the tent, recruits huddled in clusters. Whispers ran faster than ink on paper. For the first time, they saw authority crumble. For the first time, they wondered if silence was no longer survival. Rollins tried to defend himself, words falling flat. It was meant to motivate, to test resilience. Harris's answer was ice. Discipline does not come from cruelty. Leadership is not intimidation. You failed both. The recruits standing nearby heard every word, and something in their eyes shifted. By late afternoon, Elena stepped into the sunlight again. The yard was the same: dust, rifles, sweat, but the atmosphere was altered. Where there had been resignation, now there was uncertainty. Where there had been fear, now there was the faint flicker of something else. Private Stanton approached, his voice low, unsure. Sergeant, thank you. For what? Elena asked, her tone even. If you hadn't stood up, if you had, he trailed off. She placed a hand on his shoulder, steady. You did nothing wrong. Remember that. This isn't about you. It's about the system realizing it has to do better. His eyes softened, but doubt lingered, and Elena felt the weight of it. How many others had carried that same doubt every single day? Fear not of the enemy overseas, but of the men in charge here. The thought settled sharp in her chest. That evening Harris called her into a private meeting. His hawk-like eyes studied her closely. "Sergeant, you have done more than endure cruelty. You have exposed systemic failure. Your composure is noted. What you did takes courage." Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. Praise was never her aim. Survival was, truth was, change was. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "But the credit belongs to those who spoke up, to the recruits who endured." He nodded, though his gaze never softened. "Perhaps, but leadership means carrying the weight others cannot, and you've shown that." She didn't answer, because deep down she knew he was right. Night settled heavy over Fort Benning. The stars burned sharp above the yard, the same stars that had watched her in Iraq and Afghanistan, when fear came from fire in the sky, not boots in the dirt. She sat alone in the medical tent, her head bandaged, her body still aching. But it wasn't the pain that kept her awake. It was the realization that something had cracked open here, that recruits had seen power questioned, that silence had been broken. And once silence is broken, it can't be undone. The next morning was different. The air buzzed, but not with shouts, with tension, with anticipation. Every recruit moved cautiously, their steps careful, their voices hushed. Even the instructors avoided eye contact. Fear had shifted. It no longer flowed downward from them to the recruits. Now it lingered above everyone, watching. Inside the tents, the generals worked like surgeons, cutting through every detail. Every officer questioned. Every instructor scrutinized. The culture itself was on trial. Harris's words carried through the canvas like thunder. "This is not an isolated incident. It is systemic, and it ends now." Elena sat silent, listening, not for praise, not for vengeance, for truth, for proof that the system could still correct itself. But she also knew something darker. Systems resist change, and this one would fight to keep its shadows. By dusk, Rollins was pale, his authority stripped, his words useless. Recruits whispered his name like a curse, and Elena, though her temples still ached, though her body still carried the bruise, stood taller, not proud, not triumphant, just steady. Because steadiness was survival. And survival, she knew, was only the beginning. Why did silence feel heavier than gunfire? In combat, silence was a reprieve, a rare pause between barrages. But here, inside the tent at Fort Benning, silence was suffocating. It pressed against the canvas walls, against every soldier's chest, making each breath deliberate. Elena Cruz sat upright, her hands folded on her lap, her temples still tender under a strip of gauze. The generals occupied the far side of the table. Harris leaned forward, fingers steepled, his hawk-like eyes cutting through every word spoken in the room. The other generals flanked him, one calm and precise, the other colder, analytical, jotting notes with mechanical efficiency. Across from them sat the instructors, men who had ruled this yard for years. Their faces were stiff masks, but their eyes betrayed something else: panic. Fear wasn't new to them, but fear of being judged was. They had built their authority on the trembling of recruits, on the silence of subordinates. Now their own silence was being carved into record. Harris's voice finally broke the air. "Your conduct reflects a systemic failure. Training by intimidation is not training, it is abuse, and it ends now." Rollins, seated at the end of the row, clenched his fists. His jaw flexed, words trembling behind his teeth. He looked smaller than he had on the training ground, but pride is stubborn. He leaned forward, voice rough. "Sir, with respect, soldiers need hardness. If they don't learn to fear us here, they won't survive out there." The words hung like smoke. Elena's pulse quickened. She had heard this before, in a dozen forms, always from those who confused cruelty with discipline. For a moment she considered speaking, but Harris's reply came sharp and merciless. Fear is not resilience, cruelty is not discipline, and cowardice disguised as leadership will not be tolerated. Rollins flinched, but said nothing more. Elena's eyes moved across the recruits seated quietly near the back. They weren't part of the discussion, but their presence mattered. They were witnesses to the collapse of a culture that had defined their first months in uniform. She saw in their faces both awe and fear. Awe at the general's intervention. Fear of what might follow once the SUVs left and the stars returned to headquarters. What happens when the weight leaves? The thought gnawed at her. She knew how systems worked. Oversight was temporary, survival permanent. Would anything truly change when the spotlight dimmed? The investigation dragged into the late afternoon. Recruits were rotated in and out. Each gave their accounts, their words weaving into a consistent narrative. Intimidation as routine, hazing as tradition, instructors as untouchable. One young soldier spoke with trembling hands. "Sir, every day we were told pain was the only way to learn, that if we didn't take it, we didn't belong." He stopped, his eyes darting to Rollins before flicking down. "I was afraid to say anything." Elena's chest tightened. She remembered the boy's stumble during the drill, the stumble that had drawn her intervention, the stumble that had earned her the strike. Stanton. His fear was written across every syllable. Harris turned to him, his tone gentler but no less firm. "You did the right thing today, Private. Fear has no place in your silence. The Army values truth more than obedience to cruelty." Stanton nodded, but his hands still shook. When he stepped away, Elena caught his gaze for half a second. She gave the faintest nod. A quiet message: "You're not alone." That night the camp was restless. Recruits moved in hushed groups, whispers weaving through the barracks. The name Cruz carried like smoke, drifting from bunk to bunk. Some spoke it with admiration, others with unease. She had become a symbol, but symbols are double-edged. In the medical tent, Elena sat alone, peeling back the gauze to reapply antiseptic. The mirror above the wash basin showed her reflection: strong jaw, dark eyes, the faint scar tissue of older wounds across her cheekbone. She looked the same, but everything around her was altered. She thought of Afghanistan, the roadside bombs, the nights patching torn bodies by flashlight, the weight of lives pressed into her hands. She had been afraid then too, but the fear was honest. Out there, the enemy wore a uniform or carried a weapon. Here, the enemy wore rank. Her chest ached with a thought she hadn't wanted to face. Maybe survival in this system is harder than survival in war. She let the water run over her hands, cool against her skin. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to whisper into the quiet. What happens if nothing changes? The silence answered back. The following morning, Fort Benning carried a strange energy. The sun was the same, punishing, relentless, but the voices were subdued. The cadence of drills was absent, suspended by order of command. Instead, recruits moved with an awareness, eyes scanning, waiting. Elena walked across the yard, her presence pulling attention like gravity. Not because she sought it, but because her existence had become proof that silence could be broken, proof that authority could be challenged. Some recruits nodded subtly when she passed, respect flickering in their eyes. Others looked away, still afraid to stand too close to the storm. Inside the tent, Harris and the other generals gathered with aides. Piles of statements sat thick on the table, the weight of testimony heavier than any weapon. Harris's voice carried across the room. "The findings are clear. This unit failed in its duty. Corrective measures will begin immediately." Elena listened, expression unreadable. She wasn't relieved. She wasn't triumphant. She was tired, because she knew what came next wasn't glory, it was labor. The painstaking work of reshaping culture, and labor demands sacrifice. One of the generals turned to her. "Sergeant Cruz, your composure has set the standard. You'll remain here as we implement reforms. You will guide." Her chest tightened. She wanted to argue. She hadn't asked to be their example, hadn't asked to become the center of reform, but the look in their eyes told her she had no choice. She nodded once, her voice steady. "Yes, sir." By afternoon, the first changes began. Instructors were restricted from drills. Oversight was immediate. Every exercise monitored. Recruits whispered disbelief as familiar patterns shattered before their eyes. Rollins sat at a desk, stripped of command, forced into paperwork like a prisoner of his own arrogance. He glared at Elena whenever their paths crossed, but his glare carried no power now. Authority was gone, and yet his shadow lingered. During a break, Elena stood near the edge of the yard, watching recruits gather in cautious clusters. Stanton approached again, voice low. "Sergeant, do you really think things will change?" Elena studied him, the doubt etched deep into his young face. She thought of her own doubts, the questions that gnawed at her in silence. But she couldn't hand him that burden. "They have to," she said firmly. "If they don't change here, they won't change anywhere. And it starts with truth. It starts with you being willing to speak it." His eyes lingered on hers, searching for conviction. She gave it to him, even if she wasn't sure she had enough left for herself. That evening she returned to the medical tent. The ache in her temple dulled but persistent, a reminder of the moment that had set this fire burning. She sat in the dim light, her thoughts circling like vultures. She thought of Rollins's words, "Soldiers need fear." She thought of Harris's reply, "Discipline comes from respect." And she thought of the recruits, their faces caught between fear and hope, between silence and voice. Courage wasn't just battlefield survival. It was this, choosing to demand accountability when silence would be easier, choosing to carry weight no one asked you to carry. She leaned back on the cot, staring at the canvas ceiling, the muffled hum of the camp settling outside. Her eyelids grew heavy, but her mind refused to rest. Because she knew tomorrow would bring more questions, more weight, more silence to break. And courage, she realized, wasn't a single act. It was repetition. Again and again, until the silence stayed broken. Why did they look at her differently now? The same recruits who once muttered behind her back, who whispered doesn't belong and show off, now watched her every move with cautious respect, some even with admiration. Elena Cruz felt the weight of those stares each time she stepped onto the training yard. It wasn't pride that settled in her chest. It was responsibility, and responsibility is heavier than any pack she'd carried in Afghanistan. The generals had made it clear, reforms were not optional. Training would continue, but under watchful eyes. Elena's role was official now. She would guide, she would observe, she would demonstrate what leadership could look like without intimidation. Her first morning in this new role began with silence. No shouts, no barked insults, just the scrape of boots on clay as recruits lined up, unsure of how to move in this altered world. Instructors stood back, stripped of their old bravado, their eyes darting between Elena and the generals stationed at the perimeter. She stepped forward, her uniform immaculate, her voice calm but firm. "Bayonet drill, line up." The recruits obeyed, not because they feared her, but because her presence demanded attention without demanding submission. She corrected stances with quiet authority, adjusted grips with steady hands. Her instructions were clipped, precise. Focus on mechanics. Control, not rage. Every strike has a point. Find it. At first, the silence felt wrong to them. No insults, no threats, just instruction. But gradually they responded. Their movements grew sharper, their rhythm steadier. Fear had been replaced by focus. From the corner of her eye, Elena saw Rollins leaning against a fence post, relegated to paperwork, stripped of command. His jaw worked like he was chewing gravel, his glare sharp enough to cut. But it no longer reached her. His power had evaporated. And yet his shadow lingered, proof that culture does not vanish in a day. Later, Elena worked one-on-one with Private Stanton, the same recruit whose stumble had ignited the chain of events. His hands trembled as he gripped the bayonet, his stance uneven. Your posture, she said, kneeling slightly, adjusting his elbow. Strength comes from balance, not force. Focus here. He corrected, tried again. This time his strike landed firm, controlled. He glanced at her, searching for approval. She gave a single nod. Better. The boy's shoulders straightened as though the nod weighed more than 100 insults ever could. Around them, other recruits noticed. They mimicked her tone, her precision. The yard felt different, quieter, steadier. Behind them, an instructor muttered under his breath, "Too soft." Elena's head turned sharply, her eyes locking on him. He froze. She didn't need to speak. Authority radiated in her stillness, in the certainty that cruelty would not be tolerated here anymore. For the first time, fear shifted direction. The days unfolded like this. Drills monitored, exercises corrected, every interaction documented. The generals rotated through the yard, their presence steady, unblinking. Elena felt their gaze as much as the recruits did. During one drill, a recruit faltered under the heat, his body buckling. Normally, that stumble would have drawn shouting, humiliation, maybe worse. Instead, Elena moved quickly, her voice firm but even. On your feet. Breathe slow, focus. You control your body, not the other way around. The recruit steadied himself, sweat dripping down his face, but his spine straightened. He completed the drill, and the others followed, their movements sharper, fueled not by fear but by determination. Later that evening, Elena overheard a whisper between two trainees. She doesn't scare you, she just makes you better. She allowed herself the smallest smile. That was the point. That had always been the point. But resistance lingered. Old habits die hard. Some instructors struggled under the new oversight. They had built their identities on dominance, on fear. Without it, they were unsteady, unsure of who they were as leaders. One of them, Sergeant Mayers, approached her during a break. His voice was low, cautious. "Cruz, I've been doing this for 15 years. Yelling, pushing, breaking them down. It's all I've ever known. I didn't think," he paused, his throat working. "I didn't think respect would get results." Elena studied him, her gaze steady. Fear produces compliance. Respect produces excellence. Which one do you want standing next to you when things fall apart? He said nothing, but his silence carried thought. Change was happening, slowly, painfully, but it was happening. By midweek, the yard had shifted again. Where once there had been panic in every motion, now there was cohesion. Team drills improved. Communication sharpened. Mistakes were corrected without punishment, without humiliation. Recruits began to help each other, not just themselves. Elena walked the perimeter, watching, listening. Every strike, every step mattered, not because of the technique alone, but because of what it represented. Culture was being rewritten in real time, one movement at a time. She felt pride, quiet, reluctant pride, but with it came something heavier, exhaustion. Change was work, and she bore the weight of every pair of eyes watching, every expectation resting on her shoulders. At night in the medical tent, she sat alone, tending to the fatting bruise on her temple. The pain was almost gone now, but the memory lingered. She touched the spot lightly, staring into the small mirror. "This is bigger than me," she whispered, "bigger than one strike." Her reflection didn't argue. One evening, General Harris called her aside. The sun was low, painting the yard in gold and shadow. Reports stacked high on his desk, his face a mixture of fatigue and resolve. "Sergeant Cruz," he said, his voice measured. "This unit has improved in days. Performance is sharper, injuries fewer, discipline stronger. Your influence is clear." Elena stood rigid, unsure how to respond. Praise always sat uneasily with her. "This kind of change," Harris continued, "is harder than combat. It demands patience, consistency, and courage of a different kind. You've proven it can be done." She lowered her eyes briefly. "With respect, sir, it wasn't me alone. The recruits, they want this. They were waiting for someone to show them it was possible." Harris studied her, then gave a single nod. Leadership isn't about being alone, but it is about going first. His words lingered with her long after he walked away. That night, Elena walked the empty training yard. The stars stretched sharp above her, steady and distant. Her boots crunched against the clay, the silence wrapping around her like a cloak. She thought of the recruits, their eyes brighter now. She thought of Stanton, his doubts slowly transforming into confidence. She thought of Mayers, wrestling with the weight of unlearning. And she thought of Rollins, still confined to paperwork, his glare a shadow that refused to fade. Change was happening, yes, but shadows are patient, and she knew better than to believe victory was final. Courage was not a moment, courage was endurance, the daily choice to stand. She tilted her head back, staring at the stars, and allowed herself a single thought before returning to the tent. This fight is not over, but maybe, for the first time, it's winnable. Why did progress feel so fragile? Fort Bennying's training yard had changed. The rhythm was different now. Commands no longer cracked like whips but carried with them a steadiness, a purpose. Recruits moved with focus instead of fear, their bodies sharper, their teamwork more cohesive. Even the air felt lighter, as if the weight that once pressed down on every breath had been eased. And yet Elena Cruz knew the truth. Change is delicate. Like glass, it can shine brilliantly, but shatter with one careless step. Every morning she arrived before dawn. Her uniform pressed, her boots laced tight, her presence intentional. She reviewed drills, briefed instructors, observed the yard with an eye that missed nothing. Each correction was careful, measured. She wasn't simply training recruits, she was training the system to breathe differently. Instructors followed her lead, some reluctantly, others with genuine curiosity. Harsh words grew fewer, replaced by precise instruction. Where once recruits flinched at every misstep, now they adjusted quickly, unafraid of humiliation. But Elena felt the fragility in every glance, every hesitation. One misstep could drag the unit back into old patterns. One failure could unravel everything, and she carried that weight like a rucksack strapped to her spine. During a midday drill, she walked the perimeter as recruits navigated an obstacle course. Sweat soaked their fatigues, but their movements were deliberate. She stopped near Stanton, watching him steady another recruit struggling to climb a wall. "Push from your legs, not your arms," Stanton urged, his voice calm, steady. The recruit tried again and made it over. Elena's chest tightened at the sight. Only a week ago, Stanton had stumbled himself, terrified and ashamed. Now he was leading, steadying others, his voice carrying the same tone she had once used with him. Courage was contagious. But even as she felt a flicker of pride, her eyes drifted toward the fence line. Rollins was there, arms crossed, his presence a shadow that refused to fade. Though stripped of authority, he lingered like a storm on the horizon. His expression wasn't anger anymore, it was something darker, resentment. Elena turned away, focusing on the recruits. Shadows could wait. Later that evening, Harris called her into his temporary office. Papers and reports stacked high on his desk, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the tent walls. "Sergeant Cruz," he began, his tone as steady as always. "The improvements are undeniable. Performance is up, cohesion stronger. Even the skeptical instructors have begun to adapt." Elena stood at attention, her hands clasped behind her back. "Yes, sir." Harris leaned back slightly, studying her. "You've done more in days than some leaders manage in years, but I need to know," he paused, his eyes narrowing. "How long can you sustain this?" The question caught her, not because she hadn't thought about it, but because she thought about it every night. The exhaustion weighed heavy, though she never showed it. Every glance, every expectation pressed down until her shoulders ached even when unburdened. "I'll hold, sir," she replied simply. Harris didn't smile, he only nodded. "See that you do. This change must last. If it collapses, everything collapses with it." His words lingered long after she left the tent. That night, alone in the medical tent, Elena tended to the fatting bruise at her temple. The skin was healing, the pain almost gone. But the memory of the kick remained sharp, a reminder of the cost of silence and the price of truth. She stared at her reflection in the small metal mirror tracing the line of her jaw. She looked the same, but something beneath her skin had shifted. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a symbol, and symbols can't falter, not in public. She whispered into the quiet, "What happens when I break?" No answer came. The following morning, she found herself leading not just drills but workshops. Harris had ordered it, formal instruction for the instructors themselves. Elena stood at the front, her voice steady, her movements deliberate as she demonstrated techniques. "Correct posture with precision, not humiliation," she said, guiding one instructor's grip on a recruit's rifle. "Authority isn't about volume, it's about clarity." Some nodded, absorbing. Others bristled, old habits clawing at them, but none dared resist openly. Afterward, one instructor approached, his voice hushed. "Cruz, I didn't believe this would work, but it does. They listen, they perform, it's different." Elena studied him, her face neutral. Respect outlasts fear, always has. The man nodded slowly, as though realizing it for the first time. Progress, fragile but real. By midweek, the yard looked almost unrecognizable. Recruits moved with confidence, their drills sharp, their teamwork instinctive. Instructors corrected without cruelty, their authority rooted in guidance rather than intimidation. Elena walked among them, her presence both anchor and catalyst. She caught glimpses of respect in their eyes, subtle nods, straightened shoulders. She didn't need their admiration, but she accepted their trust. Still, cracks remained. During one drill, a recruit faltered badly, his frustration boiling over. He slammed his rifle into the dirt, muttering under his breath. In the old days, he would have been berated, broken down until he obeyed. Now, all eyes turned to Elena. She stepped forward slowly, kneeling beside him. "Frustration is normal," she said quietly, "but control comes from discipline. Breathe, reset, try again." The recruit's shoulders trembled, but he obeyed. His next attempt was cleaner, sharper. Around him, the others followed with renewed focus. Later, she overheard another whisper, "She doesn't break you, she builds you." Her jaw tightened, her chest heavy. Symbols build, but symbols don't get to rest. That evening, she found herself walking the yard alone again. The stars stretched above, sharp and steady, their silence pressing down. She thought of Stanton, of the recruits slowly finding strength in each other. She thought of Harris, his gaze hawkish, his words carrying the weight of command. She thought of Rollins, his shadow still clinging to the edges of the yard. And she thought of herself, tired, stretched thin, yet unwilling to yield. Courage wasn't about one act. It was about choosing again and again to endure, to speak when silence was easier, to stand when falling was tempting. Her boots crunched against the clay as she whispered into the night, "Fragile doesn't mean weak. Fragile just means it matters." And with that, she returned to the tent, ready to carry the weight again tomorrow. Why does change always meet resistance at its peak? The training yard had grown sharper in tone, cleaner in discipline. Recruits moved with precision, their teamwork instinctive, their confidence visible. Even instructors, once drunk on intimidation, now barked fewer threats, their corrections rooted in guidance instead of cruelty. For days, Elena Cruz had seen progress ripple outward like rings in water. But ripples can be disrupted. The generals had ordered a capstone exercise, a multi-stage simulation meant to test endurance, teamwork, and leadership under pressure. For recruits, it was the first true trial under the new system. For instructors, it was a mirror held to their faces. Would they cling to the old ways, or embrace the fragile reforms? The yard was transformed into a battlefield. Obstacle walls, sandbag barricades, smoke curling into the sky. Recruits carried weighted packs and dummy rifles, sweat streaming as they crawled, climbed, and sprinted under the watchful eyes of generals and aides. Elena stood at the edge, arms crossed, eyes sharp. She had insisted on staying silent, observing rather than commanding. This wasn't her trial, it was theirs. But every stumble, every hesitation felt personal. The change she'd fought for was about to be tested in real time. At first, the recruits moved with rhythm. Commands were clear, execution steady. Teams communicated, covered one another, lifted each other over obstacles. Elena felt her chest loosen slightly. Proof. This was proof it could work. Then it happened. One recruit froze midway through the course, his chest heaving, panic written across his face. He clutched his rifle wrong, his eyes darting, body trembling. In the old days, the response would have been instant, shouting, humiliation, maybe even physical punishment. And one instructor, old habits coiled in his muscles, stepped forward with that familiar fire in his eyes. Elena's pulse spiked. Before he could open his mouth, she was there. Stop. The word cut through the smoke and sweat like a blade. The instructor froze, caught between instinct and oversight. All eyes swung to Elena. She crouched beside the recruit, her voice low, steady. What's happening? I can't, he stammered. His chest rose too fast, his grip shaking. You can, she said firmly. Not because I said so, because you trained for this. Breathe. Focus on the step in front of you, not the whole course, just one step. The boy's eyes flickered. Doubt wrestled with trust. Slowly, painfully, he obeyed. His breathing steadied, his hands tightened, and he moved. First one step, then another. The team rallied around him, adjusting pace, covering him until he found his rhythm again. Elena rose, her expression neutral but her chest burning. Behind her, Harris spoke quietly to the other generals. That right there, that's leadership. Not intimidation, not cruelty, leadership. Elena didn't turn. She didn't need their praise, but she knew every recruit on that course had felt it. By the end of the day, the simulation was complete. Recruits stumbled across the finish line, exhausted but unbroken. The generals conferred briefly, nodding at the results. The difference was undeniable. Injuries fewer, teamwork sharper, confidence higher. But not everyone was convinced. Later, as dusk stretched across the yard, Elena overheard two instructors muttering near the fence line. This won't last, one whispered. When the generals leave, it'll go back to the old way, always does. The words dug into her chest like splinters. She wanted to confront them, to snap the illusion in half. But instead, she let silence hang. Because she knew the real test wasn't today, wasn't under the general's gaze. The real test would come later when no one was watching. And that test scared her more than any kick ever had. That night she sat in the medical tent, staring at the scarred reflection in the mirror. The bruise at her temple was gone, but the ache inside remained. She whispered into the stillness, "What if I can't hold it together?" For once she wished someone would answer. But solitude is the soldier's companion, and solitude does not comfort. She closed her eyes, remembering Stanton's stumble, the recruit's panic, the instructor's whispers. Change was happening, but it was fragile, so fragile. And fragility, she reminded herself, doesn't mean weakness. It means it matters. The following morning, Harris summoned her again. His gaze was sharp but not unkind. "You've proven this system works," he said. "But we both know reforms crumble without vigilance. You won't always have us here." Elena nodded. "Yes, sir." "You need to prepare them," Harris continued. "Not just recruits, instructors, officers. The culture must survive after oversight ends. Otherwise, this was nothing more than theater." His words landed heavy. They weren't wrong. The generals would leave. Headquarters would turn its eyes elsewhere. And when that day came, the yard would be left with its habits, its shadows, its choices. She straightened. "Then I'll prepare them." Harris studied her, his silence deliberate. Finally, he said, "See that you do. The army can't afford for this to fade." That afternoon, Elena gathered the instructors. They stood in a rough circle, their expressions mixed, some hardened, some humbled, some uncertain. She met their eyes one by one. "Change doesn't stick because of oversight," she began. Her voice carried, calm but sharp. "It sticks because you choose it every day. Respect isn't weakness, it's survival, and it will outlast fear if you let it." One instructor shifted, his jaw tight. "And if we do?" Elena's gaze didn't waver. "Then fear returns, and with it failure, and I won't stand by for that." The silence stretched heavy. Finally, Mayers, the one who had confessed his doubts days earlier, spoke. "She's right, I fought it, but I've seen it. It works. We'd be fools to go back." The others shifted, their resistance thinning. Elena felt the balance tilt, not victory, not final, but forward. That night she walked the perimeter of the yard under a sky sharp with stars. The clay crunched beneath her boots, the air cool against her skin. She thought of the recruits, their eyes brighter, their voices steadier. She thought of the instructors, their resistance cracking, their grudging respect forming. And she thought of herself, tired, stretched thin, but unwilling to yield. Leadership wasn't about command. It was about endurance. It was about being the one who stood when others faltered, the one who carried weight others refused to carry. Her chest ached with the thought, but she whispered it anyway, "I'll hold." And in the silence of the Fort Benning night, she believed it. Why did goodbyes always feel heavier than arrivals? The black SUVs lined the edge of the training yard at dawn. Engines idled, exhaust curling in the cool air. Generals stood in formation, their clipped voices issuing final directives to officers who scribbled furiously in notebooks. Change had been declared, reforms ordered, systems corrected. Their presence had carved order into chaos. But presence never lasts. Elena Cruz stood at attention, her eyes locked forward, her jaw set. She had known this moment would come. The stars on their collars would return to Washington, to headquarters, to places where decisions were drafted in air-conditioned rooms. Fort Benning would remain behind, dusty, restless, unfinished. Harris stepped toward her, his gaze steady. For once his voice carried a trace of softness. "Sergeant Cruz, you've done more than speak truth. You've embodied it. Don't let it die when we leave." Elena's throat tightened, though her face betrayed nothing. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the unspoken, her fatigue, her isolation, her quiet strength. Finally, he gave a sharp nod. Then he turned, climbing into the SUV. Engines roared, tires cracked against gravel, and just like that the stars were gone. The yard was silent again. The days that followed felt different. No more generals circling the perimeter. No more oversight pressing down like a shadow. Just the ordinary hum of training, the cadence of boots, the scrape of rifles, the weight of packs. But the silence wasn't the same. It wasn't suffocating anymore. It was waiting, watching. Elena resumed her post on the yard, moving between recruits, correcting stances, steadying grips. The instructors followed, not all willingly, but none openly resisting. Mayers carried himself differently now, his commands sharper yet tempered. Even Stanton, once trembling with fear, now spoke with confidence, guiding others through obstacles. Progress hadn't vanished with the SUVs. It lingered, fragile but real. And yet, Elena knew fragility is always at risk. One afternoon, Rollins approached her. He was thinner now, his authority stripped, his posture stiff with humiliation. The paperwork he'd been sentenced to was stacked under his arm, but his eyes carried something sharper. "You think this will last?" he muttered, his voice low, edged with bitterness. "You think one bruise and a few words change the army?" Elena met his gaze, unflinching. "Not the army, but it changed here, that's enough." He sneered, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. For the first time his glare felt hollow. He turned, walking away, his shadow long but powerless. Elena didn't watch him go. She had no time for ghosts. Weeks stretched into a rhythm. The yard grew sharper each day. mistakes corrected with calm precision, recruits building trust not through fear but through reliance on one another. But Elena felt the burden growing inside. Leadership wasn't just about others. It was about the self. And every night when the yard quieted, when recruits slept and stars stretched above, she returned to the medical tent. She stared at her reflection in the small metal mirror. The bruise was gone now, the scar faint. But the memory of that kick, the violence that had ignited everything, remained etched in her bones. She whispered into the silence, "Why me?" The mirror offered no answer. One evening, Stanton found her by the fence line. His face, once raw with fear, now carried steadiness. He hesitated before speaking. "Sergeant, I don't think I'd still be here if it wasn't for you." Elena turned slightly, her expression softening. "You would have found your way. You're stronger than you think." He shook his head. "No, you showed us something different. You showed us we didn't have to be afraid to belong." For the first time in weeks, her chest warmed. Not pride, not victory, something quieter, hope. She placed a hand on his shoulder firm. "Then make sure you carry it forward. Don't let it fade." He nodded, his eyes alight. As he walked away, Elena realized the truth. Change wasn't secured by generals. It wasn't even secured by her. It lived in the hands of those who chose to carry it forward. Months later, the yard looked transformed. The cadence of training was no less brutal, no less demanding, but the cruelty was gone. Injuries dropped, performance climbed. Recruits spoke of respect, not fear. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in gold, Elena walked the perimeter alone. The yard hummed with the sound of drills, but it was different now, cleaner, sharper, purposeful. She paused at the edge of the fence line, her boots sinking into the clay. She thought of Harris, of his words, "Don't let it die when we leave." She thought of Stanton, his eyes bright with hope. She thought of Rollins, his glare hollow, his shadow fatting. And she thought of herself, tired, scarred, but still standing. She whispered into the wind, "Maybe this is what resilience looks like. Not battles, not medals, just the choice to stand when silence is easier." The words faded into the evening air, but they lingered inside her. That night, as stars stretched endless above, Elena sat outside the medical tent. The recruits slept, their futures unwritten. The instructors rested, their habits reshaped. The yard was quiet, but it was alive. She leaned back, her gaze on the sky. She thought of Afghanistan, of the friends she'd lost, of the weight she carried still. She thought of the kick, the bruise, the silence that followed. And she thought of this place, this fragile corner of the army that had been forced to change. Her lips curved into the faintest, tired smile. Not triumph, not victory, just the knowledge that dignity had spoken louder than cruelty ever could. And as the night deepened, her final thought came clear, steady, certain. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.